Okay, we have Mark Pyman here. Thank you very much for joining us from Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. And Mark, I have a few questions on corruption risks in defense and security and the corporate sector. And the first one is a very general one. Can you explain to us what inherent corruption risks and problems the defense industry faces?
Okay, there's two different sets of risks. There's risks for the defense sector and there's risks for the industry and defense procurement. If you take the sector first, the number one risk is if you've got a military or an armed forces that's beset by corruption, then firstly it means they're not very effective. And if you're a senior military guy, that's your number one concern. There's lots of cases of military not being able to do what they're supposed to do for corruption-related reasons. It usually means it's dangerous for the troops because they're working with equipment that doesn't work right. It also means it's divisive. So it means the military can fall under the control of one factional element or another in the country, or it means that agents and brokers can basically foster an arms race between countries where the purchase has got nothing to do with need, it's entirely to do with enriching the agents and the people they're paying. So that's the defense sector as a whole. If you come down to the industry and procurement, which is usually where the major risk lies, certainly in the more prosperous countries, then you get the risks because most of the contracts are secret. They're usually large contracts that last for often decades, and there's a limited number of suppliers. So you've got a natural set of problems there that would lead you to corruption, particularly the secrecy element of it. So within the defense industry, it's how do you make sure that both the industry side and the government procurement side are alert to those risks and have got the relevant sets of controls and transparencies and metrics and measures to keep the risk down.
Okay, yeah. You were talking about the measures that a company can take to reduce this risk. How do you think, as a company, can you measure the quality of your corporate anti-bribery system, and how would you, say as TI or as a company, be able to identify maybe the weaknesses that you have in the system?
Actually, I think it's not that hard. And before I give my thoughts on the answer, let me give you an analogy. 30 years ago, the subject of safety was hugely on the minds of big companies, and companies were being told you're not doing this properly. And you would inevitably have the chief executive saying, but I care deeply about this subject. But the problem was there was no machinery, there were no processes underneath him to actually give effect to what no doubt was a well-meaning commitment. But it was a useless commitment, it didn't have any machinery to make it work. And the same is true of anti-corruption. You need a set of machinery within the company to make it work. And there's two halves to it. One half is integrity building and values, so that people do the right thing without needing controls. And the other half is all the control machinery and the precautionary stuff you put in place to reduce the corruption risk. So if you're talking about anti-corruption in the defense industry, then inevitably you're talking about what we call business conduct systems, which comprises both the whole ethics side of the house, values and integrity, and the anti-corruption compliance side of the house. So on the integrity side, on the integrity building side, you'd expect strong statements of values, you'd expect codes of conduct, you'd expect training of all staff in how they should behave, and the way you measure it is staff surveys. There's lots of professionalism these days about how you do them, and you can, if you do them regularly every year, every second year, that will give you a very good feedback about what people think. The other way you see it in a measurement sense is through whistleblowing and hotlines. What's the level of complaints that you get? Are they genuine? There's both a high level of response might be unhealthy, but it might also be healthy. And people are ready to speak up and are ready to talk about concerns. On the compliance side, on the anti-corruption side, there's a whole set of things you need to have in place. So it's policies, it's processes, it's risk assessment, it's training, it's leadership behavior. Again, you can set that out in I mean, we use a questionnaire of 34 questions, which covers most of those topics. You can either measure them in the way that we do as TI. We've got an index that measures defense vulnerability, the strength of the anti-corruption systems that a company has. Or if you're doing it internally, you certainly should have someone nominated on the board as the key responsible person and somebody as the key executive person responsible for ethics and business conduct and compliance. And you'd expect them to do some kind of a survey every year, not necessarily an opinion survey, but a review of what they've got in place, a review of the training, a review of how it works. They might commission external assurance from a consultancy company, for example, to give them an external opinion. So that way you can get your own self-assessment of how you think the system is working. There will always be corruption incidents. I mean, it's just life. It's just unreal to expect that there won't be. So the other really tough test is to look back at all the incidents that you had, both from really small ones up to big ones, and say, how did we respond to these? Did we respond well? Did the line manager try to shut it down because he was embarrassed by what it found? Did it lead to changed behavior afterwards? All sorts of relatively straightforward questions. So I think in terms of how can a company know whether it's got an effective system, actually I think, if you're serious about this, you can do that quite easily.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive on the systems. And one of the things you also mentioned was the role of the chief executive and the leadership. And that brings me to the next question. In terms of organizational culture within that organization, when you're building up the systems, how much of a role do you think does that play, and how important is organizational culture, and how can you maybe build a good culture within the organization?
Well, it's a cliche to say that organizational culture is really important. I mean, yes, it is. And the tone from the top, as they call it, is equally important. But don't get carried away with that, because whilst you need it, there will inevitably be times when a new chief executive has other priorities and it's not anti-corruption. So it might well be that the tone from the top vanishes for 3 or 5 years relative to what it was before. So you have to have a system, a program that will work solidly through the company, even if nothing's happening at the top, even if the chief executive isn't talking about the subject, for example. So on the organizational culture side, if you've got the values fairly deeply embedded through training, through behavior, through reinforcement by the line managers, that culture, that will last a few years, even if it's not being actively fed from the top. And if it's reasonably embedded, then your line manager and his or her line manager and his or her line manager will just naturally be behaving like that. So for example, I was this morning at a meeting with Lockheed Martin, and Lockheed Martin's culture is actually, it's an engineering culture. You need to be really sure about things before you say anything to the outside world about it. So you have to be technically super solid. And that pops up in the corruption stuff. So they've actually got pretty good systems, but until they're absolutely sure it's working perfectly, they don't want to tell the outside world about them. Now, that happens to work against them. But the point there is that the organizational culture is working really strongly, in a long-term sense, in a positive way here. If you've got a poor culture, then actually I think you can change it within 3 or 4 years. It's not that hard a thing to do. But the converse is also true, that if you've got a new chief executive who doesn't care about the subject, then you can, within 2-3 years, that culture will degrade very quickly. In terms of the leadership themselves, if you've got a really strong leader on the subject, it's very evident. So for example, we did this company's index 6 months ago, which meant we had to read the chief executive's statement for every single code of conduct of all 129 companies. You get an immediate feel for which chief executives actually wrote it and which ones got their PR or their legal people to write it. And you almost need look no further as to whether or not the chief executive was serious about the subject. So actually, it's really easy if you're an employee to sort of know, does my chief executive care about this subject or not? Whatever the words are, it's very obvious whether they mean it or not. But I still come back to what I said earlier, that to to think you have to have that in order to put a decent system in place, I think is wrong, and it's kind of putting off the moment by looking for some other perfect world to materialize.
Okay, that's an interesting point, because one of the recent cases we've seen, of course, in defense corruption was Mechanica, and perhaps there are some kind of good or not so good practices that can be drawn out of that case. From the work that you've been doing on defense companies, what would you say are the best practice areas or good practice areas that maybe distinguish a good company from a company that doesn't have standards quite as strong?
There's half a dozen that came out of the research that we did, the index that I've mentioned a couple of times. The first one is, do you report publicly on what your anti-corruption systems are? Because if you don't, it might mean you've got them, but are choosing not to make them public. But the more likely explanation is that you just don't have them. If you are public about them, then it means you're confident enough to face challenge that they're good enough to talk about publicly. The second one is the leadership speaking out about the subject? That can be misused. You can get people who bang on about the subject whilst not really doing anything about it. But in general, I think that's not the case. And you often find, particularly board members, sort of think it's somehow beneath them to talk about such a technical subject. I think that's completely the wrong attitude. So how much does the leadership, really chief executive and the board chairman, how much do they talk about their intolerance of corruption, and in what forums, and is it regular, and is it credible? The second one is, how does the board of the company assure itself that the anti-corruption machinery is working? It's not a trivial question, because you've got a load of processes. It's very easy for them to be just tick box processes. So does the board chairman care? And if he or she cares, what do they actually do to answer that question? It might be they get an outside company to review the whole thing, so they get an independent opinion. It might be they've got a really solid set of checks and balances inside the company where people are verifying what's going on. There's no instant answer to the question, but there has to be an answer. The third is risk assessment. So how do you assess what your corruption risks are? Lots of companies will say they have a corruption risk assessment mechanism. Actually, all it consists of is looking up a country under TI's Corruption Perception Index and say, oh, it's number 130, we've done our risk assessment. That's all it is. The best companies have got really good risk assessment mechanisms. They assess risk, corruption risk by product, they assess it by contract, and they assess it by geography. And they're really solid, serious processes. And that's a very telling question. Next question is, do they flow down their anti-corruption machinery down to their suppliers and across to their partners? It's much harder to do that than just to set up machinery inside your own company. And the last question, the two last questions, one is training. How extensive is it? In particular, how well is it targeted at people in vulnerable positions? So sales jobs and government relations jobs. And lastly, what does their whistleblowing machinery look like? They're bound to, most companies have it. So the issue isn't, do you have hotlines and helplines and so on? The issue is what happens when you get the calls. And that's a much more testing question. And that would certainly sort out the good ones from the less good ones.
Okay. Maybe just as a last question for 1 or 2 minutes, because we're running out of time, but if we're looking at the Finmeccanica case maybe as an example of where things didn't go so well, if they were to ask you now what they would need to do in terms of anti-corruption organizational change, what would you give them as a piece of advice? What would be the first thing they would need to do now?
Well, my starting point would be, what's your baseline? What seems to work and what seems not to work? And the place I would start is when we did this company index. Finmeccanica was one of the companies. They scored sort of in the middle, not particularly well, but not terribly either. But that gave answers to all 34 questions. If I was Finmeccanica, I would do that analysis again myself, internally, with all the data at my disposal, to have a second, so that either I validate what TI has said, or I know whether I'm better or worse on a particular question. And I would use that as the starting point for a broader-based plan. The issue will certainly require strong leadership, but that won't be sufficient because this is a company that's been in place for a long time. It's the monopoly supplier by far across the whole of the Italian government. So where there are bad practices, they're going to be very deeply embedded, and it's going to be very hard to change them. So you're talking comfortably a 5-year program from here to a point where you think the company's in better shape. The other two other things I think you need to do. One is, I think you need to have outside people involved, because if it's your own internal initiative, the chances of you running out of energy or someone just somehow not picking up the serious issues are really high. So whether that's an outside company, whether it's an NGO, whether it's just outside experts, so BAE, for example, used a sort of set of 3 wise people. EADS at the moment is using a sort of expert ethics and anti-corruption guy. You just must have outsiders to keep you honest, if you like. The other thing for something as big as Finmeccanica is you have to have the government on your side, because that's the other half of the equation. So you have to say to the government, we need you to work with us, because it takes 2 to bribe someone. So we need your help. We need to know that we'll have your support when we tell you about corrupt people in your administration. And that requires a very high level engagement indeed initially with the Italian government and the Italian defense forces.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for this in-depth interview and giving us more insight into the world of defense and security corruption.
Well, I hope we have a good discussion. I'm sorry not to be at the other half of the discussion.
Yes, thank you. Bye.